Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at ancient Mesopotamia, covering a huge time period of 3,500 years from 4000 BCE to 500 BCE. Here are your video goals questions. You should have guided notes, but if you don't, you might want to take a moment to write these down and follow along as we go. We're going to start by looking at geography. Just like everywhere else, the societies that develop in Mesopotamia are determined by geographic patterns there. The most important geographic feature of Mesopotamia are the two major rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. That's actually where the region Mesopotamia gets its name. It means between two rivers. Now, some key things to know about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. One is that they flood irregularly, which can be both good or bad if you're trying to live next to them. It's good because it provides rich soils every time it floods, because of the river mud. It's bad because it can be very destructive. The rivers also allow for irrigated agriculture. This is where you use the water from the rivers to sustain your crops. And this is important because it's pretty much a desert anywhere not right next to the river. And the rivers also make long-distance trade possible because you can use boats to ship stuff up and down the river. And all of this allows for the development of the first cities ever on the banks of these rivers. All around the Tigris and Euphrates, though, you have either deserts or mountains. And you don't get cities here. You can't have a city in the middle of a desert at this point. And so instead, the people here become nomadic herders. These people are hard to control because they can just move around wherever they want. And the cities make up a name for these people, and that name is barbarians. These people are hard to control, and they seem really scary to the people who live in the cities. And a lot of the history of the region is a history of the city dwellers and the barbarians interacting with each other, sometimes in not very nice ways. So what makes a city? A city is a large permanent settlement of 10,000 or more people with a shared group identity. So they identify with the city and with like maybe the major god of that city or something like that. Cities develop near rivers because irrigated agriculture makes it possible to produce enough food to support those people, and it allows for long-distance trade. These two together allow for specialization because you have enough food and enough materials to produce more advanced stuff like metal tools or woven clothing and stuff like that. So there are obvious advantages of living in a city, but there are also some serious problems. And a lot of what happens in Mesopotamian history is an attempt by these cities to solve these major problems. So these problems are the risk of natural disasters like flood or disease or famine, the problem of having a lot of strangers who don't know each other living right next to each other, which can lead to a lot of crime. And there's also the big problem of attacks from other cities or nomads, because cities have lots of good stuff and other people want to take them. So Mesopotamia is going to try and solve these problems, and in doing so, they're going to come up with a lot of the major innovations that define all civilizations going forward. So let's look first at the religious system developed in Mesopotamia. In many ways, this religious system can be viewed as Mesopotamia's attempt to deal with the problems of the natural world, like flooding and warfare and disease and stuff like that. So the Mesopotamians believed in a polytheistic religious system. Polytheism is any religion that has multiple gods in charge of different things. So, for example, you've got the weather god, Marduk, who controls like the skies and rain and stuff like that. And then you've got the goddess of war and love, Ishtar, which I think is an interesting combination there. They had a whole sorts of other gods, like thousands of different gods. Now, what the gods do is they control the natural world. And if the gods like you, then things will go well. The rain will fall, the river won't flood, stuff like that. If the gods don't like you, you'll get sick, the river will flood, and you'll be conquered and killed. So the whole key of Mesopotamian religion is keeping the gods happy. And how you do this is by performing specialized rituals in special places. So the kings and priests, who we'll talk about in a minute, their job was to perform specialized rituals. And this could be like sacrifice, like you might like slaughter an animal or give like a bunch of grain to a god. Or you might do special prayers or readings from holy texts and stuff like that. And these special rituals would be performed in temples. And temples were any special religious area reserved for the gods. And one particular kind of temple that was built in the most important Mesopotamian cities was the ziggurat. The ziggurat was a giant step-shaped pyramid, which you can see right here. And at the very top, there was a house where the god would dwell. And the king was the only one who was allowed to go up there. So the king could go up to the top of the ziggurat and talk to Ishtar or Marduk or any of the other major gods and provide sacrifices and receive omens and stuff from the gods up there. So that's one of the reasons why kings were so powerful. So that's Mesopotamian religion. It's an attempt to influence the gods in order to control the natural world. Let's look a little bit more at kings and what kings did in Mesopotamian cities. So every Mesopotamian city had a king. And the kings were supposedly chosen by the gods to rule the city. And what the kings would do is, because the kings had chosen them, they would then use their special connection with the god to keep the city safe. And this system is what gave the kings their legitimate power. They got to do special stuff because they had a special relationship with the gods. Now, what did the kings actually do with this power? Well, the first thing that every king did is they established a system of taxation. Kings would gather taxes, and the taxes were usually in the form of grain. And so the kings would go around and they would collect grain from every farmer in the city. And then they would use this grain to get other stuff done. So they would store all of this grain in their palace, and they would use this grain to pay supporters to do stuff. One thing that they would do is they would establish law codes. So they would write down a list of rules, and this would allow strangers to work together. So all the strangers in the city didn't know each other, but they all knew the same system of rules, so they could all cooperate and work together. This was also used to maintain property and social hierarchy, which we'll look at a little more later. And last of all, the kings were supposed to lead in wartime. So they would develop a special system of warfare in order to defend the city. The kings would use money from taxes in order to pay for a professional army of soldiers. And these soldiers would then be used to either defend the city or attack other cities. The king would also build walls in order to keep people out of the city, and they were expected to lead soldiers in battle. So the kings were actually there fighting in the front line. So in Mesopotamia, what you get at first are little tiny kingdoms called city-states. And basically, this is just a city that controls its immediate surrounding area and doesn't control anybody else. They're basically little micro-countries. It'd be like if Raleigh was its own little country. So there were, when we start out in Mesopotamian history, you have lots and lots of tiny little independent city-states. What happens over time, though, is some of these cities become more powerful, and they're able to send their armies out and take over and conquer other cities. And when this happens, you get the first empires. So an empire is when one city-state is able to conquer and control one of the other city-states. And over time, as roads get better and armies get more advanced, you start to see bigger and more powerful empires. And next week, we're going to look at the Persian Empire, which is the biggest empire to develop in the ancient Middle East. All right, another important cultural development in the first Mesopotamian cities was the development of writing. Writing is the ability to store data on a physical form using symbols that represent ideas. So writing develops in Mesopotamia at first just as a way of keeping track of business deals. So if you, let's say you were a big-time farmer and you wanted to trade like 20,000 things of barley in exchange for 1,000 cows now and 1,000 cows later, you would want to write all of that down to keep track of who owes you what and make sure you get paid the amount that was agreed. So in order to keep track of all of this, the Mesopotamians came up with a system of symbols that represented different things. They had a symbol for wheat, they had a symbol for barley, they had a symbol for cows, a symbol for whatever. And it started out just like that, like little counter tokens, almost like in a board game. But over time, the Mesopotamians realized that they could use these symbols to represent any kind of idea at all. So you could have a symbol for happiness or a symbol for king and stuff like that. And this allowed for the formation of the first ever system of writing called cuneiform. And cuneiform was really hard to learn, and it had thousands and thousands of different symbols. But if you were able to learn it, you could have a really sweet job as a scribe. And once writing is developed, it allows Mesopotamian cities to do all sorts of amazing stuff. First and most importantly, writing allows for governments to become much more powerful than before. And the reason for this is that knowledge is power. And Governments are all about power. If you are a king and you don't know what's going on, you're actually not very powerful, no matter how powerful you think you are. If stuff can happen that you don't know about, then you're not really in charge. And so kings would use writing in order to keep track of what was going on in their kingdom. You could keep track of who had paid you taxes and who hadn't, so who owed you money. You could use it to keep track of how much stuff you had, so you'd know how many soldiers you had and how many swords and how many horses, so that way you could make informed choices about going to war. You could write down law codes to keep all of your citizens obedient and working together. You could use letters to exchange information with important people. You could use maps to keep track of your territory and all sorts of stuff. So writing makes kings much more powerful because they actually know what's going on because they can use this system of writing. Writing is also very important for all sorts of other stuff, though. In religion, it can be used to write down holy texts, which can allow for the spread of religious ideas. You can use it in trade to keep track of your deals. You can use it in math to make complex calculations. And you can use it in science to record data. So you can start keeping track of patterns in the natural world. Writing is super huge, and it allows for the rapid exchange of information in basically every field of civilization. The last thing we're going to look at is Mesopotamian social stratification. So in Mesopotamia, the upper class are the kings and priests. And we already know that these guys are basically in charge of communicating with the gods. The king also is in charge of writing laws, and he owns a lot of land. Now, under the kings and priests, everybody else's job or position in society is determined by how much property they own. The people on top are the people who own property. And the more property you own, the further up the pyramid you go. So you could own either farmland or real estate in the city, like maybe a pottery workshop or something. And you would be in charge of all the other people who worked in this property. So if you owned a lot of farmland, you would be the boss of all the farmers who worked on that land. Now, one thing that's important to note is basically all property owners in Mesopotamia were men. If you were a woman, you could sometimes get some property, but that property would immediately go to your husband or your kids as soon as you had either of those things. So men had lots of power in Mesopotamia because they were the ones who owned the property. The lower middle class were people who were not property owners, but who were not slaves. These were people who neither owned property nor were property. And this could be people who worked on the farms, skilled laborers like potters, and soldiers. Also any other job where you could support yourself. And the lowest class were slaves. Slaves are people who are legally owned by other people. And you could become a slave in a number of ways, like if your parents were slaves, or if you were captured in a battle, or if you went into debt and couldn't pay off your debt. All of these could lead to you becoming a slave. And slavery was super important in Mesopotamia because there were lots of really important jobs that were also really terrible, like digging irrigation canals, or plowing fields, or building walls. All of this was super brutal, hard labor. And the system that Mesopotamia came up with to make sure that it all got done was to force people to do it through the system of slavery. So basically how it works in Mesopotamia is the more property you own, the higher up in the pyramid you go. And the lowest you can become is a slave when actually instead of owning property, you are property. All right, so we just covered a whole bunch of stuff. That's pretty much all that we've got for today. We'll go into detail on all of this stuff in class. This is kind of just a quick overview of all the stuff we're going to be looking at. So I hope you enjoyed that quick overview. Take a minute to make sure you answered all of these questions. And if there's stuff here that you really don't get or that doesn't make a lot of sense, ask about it in class tomorrow and we can have kind of a discussion about it. All right, good work. See you all tomorrow.